BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
It seems that Bustiano was taking his after-lunch stalk up the hill to stretch his legs and enjoy the cool air up there on the mountain, gazing out at the view and the grazing flocks. My father told me that people said Bustiano seemed lost in thought, as always when he had a difficult case to deal with. In the court of assizes, he was tireless, and anyone who entrusted their case to him knew that all that could possibly be done would indeed be done, but not for the money. He pretty often defended for nothing. But all the same, he had his reward, earning the respect of the whole community. Fact is, he wasn't on the breadline. There were some worse off than he was, as it is with everyone. So his case wasn't going well, and his defendant had taken to the hills. He was defending a youngster whose mother, Zia Rosina, made bread and pastries which she sold from home. Anyway, this woman's son, Zenobi, a fair-haired, blue-eyed wonder of young manhood, had got into trouble at the very end of December. Out of the blue, he was accused of stealing some lambs. So his mother goes to see Bustiano, all got up in her embroidered headscarf and lace-trimmed apron. "Avvocato, this is none of my son's doing. I know him inside out. You must defend him, because they listen to you. You're an important person. Just tell me how much it'll cost." He must give himself up. If he remains a fugitive from justice, the whole thing becomes more difficult. Do you think I haven't told him so myself? I've told him it would be better to put himself in the hands of the law, because he hasn't done anything wicked. But you know as well as I do, if you don't have friends at court. And what did he say? That he had nothing to do with it, that they've played a dirty trick on him. "Sit down," the lawyer responded. "Make yourself comfortable, and then tell me everything, down to the last detail."
There she was, sitting in front of me, a tiny little person, all got up in her Sunday best. She told me that late December evening, when Sergeant Arturo Poli, temporarily in command of the local Carabinieri station, presented himself at the door of her cottage, her whole life came to a complete stop. This son of hers was incapable of wrongdoing, that he had always worked in service, and no one had ever had any complaint. Indeed, his employers loved him like a son. And in fact, the testimony of Cosma Casula Pes and his unmarried brother Bartolomeo turned out to be a paean of praise with regard to Zenobi. But they were upset that such a breach of faith, 9 lambs stolen, had been wrought by the very farmhand they trusted the most.
And then there was the matter of Sardinia, because it was common knowledge that the two young people were attracted to one another. He's a handsome lad, but she's a dainty little Madonna, delicate as a piece of porcelain. And moreover, it seems that Cosma Casula Pes, her father, was not at all that unhappy about this attachment, even though Sardinia was only 17 and Zenobi was already 24. Nothing official, far from it. So closely was she chaperoned every moment of the day. She had these green eyes, Sardinia had, and raven black hair. Nor had she any lack of suitors or advantageous offers of marriage. It was at this point that the troubles started. They wanted to get Zenobi out of the way, declared Zia Rosina. Who knows who? Maybe someone else who had set eyes on the beauty of Sardinia. Maybe it was even her mother, Dolores Casula Pes, who turned her nose up at the mere idea of such a marriage. Not that Donna Dolores herself had been anything much before her own marriage. Her mother was in service, a mere hired hand.
Zia Rosina said that Zenobi was constantly edgy and upset in the days after the business of these lambs came up. It hurt his feelings that no one had come forward to express doubts about his guilt. In fact, I found it hard to understand how things had turned out the way they had. Zenobi had been constantly employed by the Casula Pes family for 6 years, during which time his conduct seemed to have been exemplary. So much so that only a couple of years before the robbery he was entrusted to bargain on his employer's behalf at the sheep market. He made a good deal, with the result that Zenobi could thereafter number 10 of his own sheep grazing along with those of his employers. At the end of September he escorted his boss's wife and daughter to Lula for the novena of San Francesco, having prepared all the provisions for the parish hospice and seen to replenishing the stores every other day, 5 or 6 hours on horseback to get there and the same back. That may have been the turning point of the whole business. I can almost see Cisania and Zenobi casting each other covert glances all the way. He on horseback with his blue jacket open on his shirt front, she dressed all in white, like a bride, her head lowered but jolted by the movement of the ox-cart.
It seemed to be all arranged, Avocado, Zia Rosina told Bustiano. At first they said the whole thing could be settled by paying a fine, but who's going to convince Zenobi of that? I must think it over. Come back this afternoon and we'll see, Bustiano told her. What about after you've had your lunch, Avocado? No, later, about 5 o'clock. After lunch, I take a walk to help me think more clearly. May the Lord enlighten you, replied Zia Rosina. So, after lunch, he set off for Biscolai. Hot it was, my father told me. Hot enough to roast any man alive who set foot on the road.
I was glad that under that blazing sun, when even the dogs in the yard were curled up in the shade, there was not a soul stirring abroad, as if 3 in the afternoon had been 3 at night, except for the light. Fierce it was, etching my shadow on the flagstones in the blackest Indian ink. I don't know exactly why that afternoon I decided to change my route. I only know that I yearned to flee the overwhelming heat, the broiling plateau of granite slabs, and the rust-coloured dust that fouled the air. Maybe that afternoon I was feeling strong enough and mad enough to plan not so much a stroll as a real hike. So I said to myself, let's have a change today and go to Biscolai. I was led by my sense of smell, almost entirely by that, while my pupils strove to find a gap through the slits of my eyelids, half shut to protect my eyes from the glare. As I walked, leaning on the stick that I planted at least a step ahead of me, my brain stopped asking itself too many questions.
In short, Bustiano agreed to defend him, but the case was not easy. All the worse because Zenobi had gone into hiding. He had guilt written all over him. They had been on the point of reaching an agreement that Zenobi should pay the price of the vanished lambs plus a fine amounting to the tidy sum of 100 lire, which in those days was a lot of money, considering that the entire value of the lambs was more or less 20 lire. The agreement seemed reached. Everything looked settled. If Zenobi paid up, he wouldn't have to go to prison.
It wasn't the money, Avocado, because thank the Lord we have a little put by. It wasn't because of the 100 lire, Zia Rosina explained to me. You know why as well as I do. If he paid up, it'd mean he'd committed the crime. And so, instead, he'll be committed to prison. Trying to improve matters, you've made them worse. Do you realize that? Perhaps prison was better, because even if he paid, he would be punished. They'd no longer go on employing him. And besides— You mean Cisania? Yes, Cisania. That was what they were out to do, to break the bond between those two, because they didn't think my son worthy of a cassula pes, you see. He was too good for them. That's why they destroyed him. Why didn't you speak out at once, then? He wouldn't have it. He didn't want Sisania to be so much as mentioned. In any case, on the night of the theft, Zenobi wasn't even in Nuoro. He stole no lambs. Well, if he wasn't in Nuoro, where was he? Who knows? We won't get anywhere like this. You've got to trust me. On the soul of my husband, wherever he may be in heaven, I swear I do not know. So, how do you come to be so sure? He is my son. I know him like the back of my hand. Anyway, I found this in his haversack while I was putting in some fresh bread. What is it? Don't ask me. I can't read. It was a printed piece of paper, a receipt from Bacchissio Lecci's travelling photographer, lifelike portraits at bargain prices. Studio, Via della Pietà 36, Ozieri. On the back, written in pencil, were the letters AQB and the number 29. Perhaps irrelevant, but worth looking into. I applied to Sergeant Poli of the Carabinieri. He told me there was no mention of the photograph anywhere in the file, but that in his opinion it had no bearing on the case. I was not so sure. Maybe it could help me prove that Zenobi was not in Nuoro on the night of the theft. I asked for a check-up on the trading licenses for the month of December, to see if the photographer had also come to our parts around Nuoro. The sergeant gave me a wry smile. Trading licenses? He found this hilarious.
Everyone does what they like here. They don't apply for a permit, even to build a house. So, do you expect them to when they want to take a couple of photographs? The sergeant was fairly certain that no travelling photographers had come to Nuoro at that time. But Bustiano was not the man to give up. If there was a photograph, he wanted to see it. He wanted a firm date. The fact was that he believed Zia Rosina.
Nothing seemed to hang together. Zenobi had no need to steal those lambs. Given a little patience, he might even have been able to marry Sisania. He was a decent young man and well regarded. Unexpectedly one evening he leaves Nuoro for God knows where, and the night following his departure 9 lambs are stolen from the Cassula Pes's sheepfold, lambs worth only 19 or 20 lire. With the Cassula Pes's attempt to reach a settlement with him, that put them in the right. It would mean a verdict of guilty, unless Zenobi gave himself up.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
A week before the hearing, Bustiano said he was going to visit an old friend in Ozieri. He took the train from Nuoro and arrived in the late afternoon. And there he found catastrophe awaiting him. The photographer was dead in a fire that had destroyed his studio 48 hours earlier. In Ozieri, there was a certain Sergeant Tuvoni of the Royal Guard, a tubby little man with a handlebar moustache. In his opinion, the case already had a name plastered all over it. Zenobi Sanna, fugitive from justice. This was a blow for Bustiano. He decided to go and talk to this sergeant.
He was sceptical about my being an Ozieri so soon after the fire, and confined himself to telling me what I already knew. 2 nights previously, a fire had destroyed the Lecce studio with the owner inside it. From the charred remains, it was clear that Lecce had been surprised by the flames while at work in the dark room. Nothing had survived, not a ledger, not a photographic plate, not a receipt. Whoever had started the blaze was out to eliminate an awkward witness. But witness to what?
I am here officially to ask what are the charges against my client. Arson and first-degree murder, as well as robbery and misappropriation. Need I go on? Replied the sergeant. I see no connection between my client and Lecce, said Bustiano. The sergeant gave him an affable smile. I have here the record of an exchange of letters with Sergeant Poli of the Nuoro Carabinieri, informing me of what I should call an extremely close connection between your client and the photographer. Bustiano tugged angrily at his beard. He had supplied that connection himself. At that rate, he said, we would have to suspect anyone else who had their photograph taken by Lecce. Anyone might have had something to hide. How right you are, Avocado, how right you are. There's nowhere in the world with more things to hide than here. The fact seems to me circumstantial. In a court of law, perhaps, Avocado, smirked Sergeant Devoni. But we are simple, labouring men. We do the dirty work outside the law courts, so we don't have all that much time for quibbles. At this point, Bustiano began to lose patience. There are no quibbles here, not in this case. Moreover, some measure of attention to the details of the matter would not come amiss to a person claiming to administer justice. What do you mean by that? It was the sergeant's turn to lose his temper. Do you suggest that I should allow you to thwart our efforts? To let all those rogues go free? To make heroes of them? I should like to see you crawling on hands and knees into every ravine and cave. Sergeant, I can only presume that you have nothing in hand with which to bring charges against my client. The sergeant went purple in the face. What sort of civilization is this? He thundered. How can we claim to be admitted to human society if all the tremendous toil forced upon us day by day is reduced to nothing in the courts of law? No one is exempt, Sergeant. We are all bound, as you are, to serve that blindfold lady with the scales of justice. Moreover, we have to fight against prejudice, against sentences pronounced before a case comes to trial. This, I fear, is what sets us apart from human society, as you put it. However, it is late, and I think I have taken up too much of your time, concluded Bustiano as he got to his feet. He had all but reached the door when the sergeant stopped him in his tracks. A price has been put on your client's head, he announced, as Bustiano's hand touched the door handle. 2,000 lire. So Zenobi Sana had become an outlaw, a bloodthirsty beast in the eyes of all. He had entered the ranks of those who cause old women to cross themselves at the mere mention of his name. Bustiano returns from Ozieri to find things looking blacker and blacker for Zenobi. Nor can he get anything out of Zia Rosina, for all she can do is weep. Meanwhile, for the business with the lambs, the sentence handed down to Zenobi in his absence is 6 years' imprisonment. And the months pass.
The 13th of November, almost exactly a year after the event, I set off for my usual walk. I climb under the seminary archway, give a passing wave to the law courts, and then off towards the scrublands and the young oaks. I am crunching my way over the acorns when I hear a rustling sound behind me. Without looking back, I forge ahead towards the summit. A few bluish clouds are hovering above the sheer bluffs. Rain's on the way, I think. though the air is so clear, the landscape so limpid, that I seem to be within the very source of light. I am turning over these thoughts when, with the rustling behind me, comes the snap of a twig underfoot. I turn round with a start.
Sardinia? Asks Bustiano, eyeing the slender figure that has stiffened to a statue a few steps behind him. She makes a gesture of assent. Hers is a beauty quite out of the ordinary, in the full lips that seem stamped in vivid red on the immaculate ivory face, in the deep green eyes, the shapely brow onto which fall a few almost blue-black locks escaped from her headscarf. "Will I ever see him again?" she asks in the ghost of a voice, as she worries the black beads of a rosary. "He wasn't even in Nuoro that night. He wasn't even here." Bustiano is at a loss what to say. "Child, why didn't you say so at once?" is the best he can come out with. And he thinks that this reproof, so oft repeated, like the words of a psalm, makes this story into a story of things not said. Sardinia shakes her head for a long time before speaking. "He didn't wish it," she says at last. "He preferred to go into hiding rather than—" And she is shaken with fresh sobs. Bustiano takes a step towards her, stretches out a hand to lay on her shoulder, but Sardinia backs away. "If he doesn't show up, there's nothing we can do," says Bustiano. "He knows who stole those lamps," she blurts out all of a sudden. "Who was it?" demands Bustiano. "My father," she answers almost in a whisper. In short, Cosma Cosulapes had put a good face on it when he realized that Sardinia and Zenobi were attracted to one another. But he can't have been too pleased about it. So to get rid of a possible son-in-law who was as poor as a church mouse but too good-looking, he sends him out of Nuoro to a farm near Galteli, miles and miles away, to see to a matter of some unbranded cattle. Awaiting him is the steward, a young man from Posada. The order is to check over the herd of some 30 head and brand them within 48 hours. Zenobi and the steward set to work. "My child, you should have spoken out earlier," sighs Bustiano gently, so as not to add to her alarm. "I didn't know," she protests. "I didn't know until now about Galteli and the herd. And what about this steward from Posada? Who is he? We may still be in time." "He's someone I've only seen a couple of times. His name's Pereda, Luigi Pereda." "Good. If the charge of robbery is disproved, everything will be easier." "We are in your hands," murmurs Sardinia. Then she rummages under her apron, draws out an envelope and offers it to him. Bustiano hesitates. "What is it?" "I don't know. He gave it to me to give to you." Bustiano takes the envelope, on which his name is written in bold, clear letters. He puts it in his pocket. It needs but a touch to tell him that it contains something more than a mere sheet of paper. The weather is turning nasty, so just as soon as the girl has vanished from his sight, Bustiano makes his way back home. When he gets inside, he seizes the envelope, opens it with a kitchen knife and extracts a photograph. The gilt lettering at the bottom leaves no room for doubt. Leicis Photographic Studio, Via della Pietà 36, Ozieri. The subject is a sturdy, fair-haired youngster gazing intently towards the photographer, yet beyond, as if eager to escape from the frame and look into the eyes of whoever he had in his own mind's eye. He is bareheaded. His irises are so pale that they almost shade off into the whites of his eyes around sharp, jet-black pupils.
Finally, I take off my cloak. I pick up the photograph again. Only the subject himself is in focus, and vivid with it, because that young man wants to live his own life on his own terms, which are terms acceptable everywhere else, but not here in Nuoro.
My father, who, as I have told you, knew him well, says that in the days that followed his meeting with Sardinia, Bustiano had a bee in his bonnet. He could not resign himself to it when he thought of that youngster who had gone on the run for no reason. In the salon of the Café Tedemanzi, Sergeant Poli handed Bustiano a glass of wine. It was at that moment that Corporal Goguzzi of the Carabinieri appeared in the glare of the doorway, contracting his brows as he peered into the dimness in search of his boss. For Sergeant Poli, who had his back to the entrance, it was enough to see that Bustiano's expression changed, to realize that his work break was over. He turned, saw Goguzzi, and beckoned to him. The latter sprang to obey, threading his way between the tables. He saluted and confined himself to saying, "Cosma Casula Pace," adding only, "at Mereri." And thus they found him, apparently asleep at the foot of a wild olive tree, his gun propped up against the trunk. He had been shot at close quarters. His white shirt was reduced to a mush of red gore from breastbone to throat. Beneath the yellowish skin, the flesh was ripped open like crimson velvet. The ground on every side of him was soaked by abundant streams of blood.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Sergeant Poli elbowed his way through the small crowd that had collected round the body. Two carabinieri gave him a brief summary. They had been together, Cosma and Sardinia, looking over the farm. Cosma had brought his gun along on the chance of bagging a hare or two. Sardinia had had a picnic prepared, and they ate under a giant wild olive tree. The girl had slipped off on her own for a few minutes to fill her apron with chicory and wild fennel. Then she heard a shot. He's bagged a hare, she thought. So she made her way back quite calmly, and she found him on the ground, as if asleep, not a dead hare in sight, but blood, rivers of it. Sergeant Poli gave Bustiano a meaningful look. He bumped him off. Zenobi bumped him off while he was asleep. It's obvious. He wasn't killed in his sleep, said Bustiano, approaching the olive tree. You see here? He asked the sergeant. Poli turned to the part of the trunk Bustiano was pointing at. It was about 1.5 meters from the ground. Hundreds of pellets had penetrated the wood. Tiny spatters of blood and flesh had stained the bark. He was on his feet when they shot him, concluded Bustiano. Even if that were so, returned the sergeant, it wouldn't change matters. It does change them, substantially, reflected Bustiano. Sergeant, he said at length, why shoot him? The sergeant smiled faintly. What a question. To kill him. Yes, of course. But why shoot him with his own gun? Perhaps your client had no weapon with him. What? A fugitive from justice, going around without a weapon? He wasn't to know he would meet his sworn enemy. Casula Pace probably put down his gun for some reason, and Sana seized his chance. The sergeant continued. Most likely, the victim had decided to take a rest in the shade of the tree, and Sana took him by surprise. Yes, he just happened to see him, went up so close as to take his gun, then backed off far enough to be able to shoot. Come off it, Sergeant. You make it all too complicated, but the situation is as clear as daylight. Casula Pace had nodded off, and Zenobisana shot him dead with no trouble at all. He wasn't asleep. The shot was too high. Cosma Casula Pace slipped down into the position in which he was found. We're wasting time making improbable conjectures, Avocado.
The sergeant gave me a stare. The decent person I had been until then was changing before his eyes into a shady lawyer prepared to go to any lengths to save his own client. Except for the fact that, technically, Zenobisana could not be held to be my client. I had never met him. The only picture I had of him was a photograph which did not exonerate him from anything. Indeed, on the contrary, it forged the strongest possible link between him and the murdered photographer Lecis. There was another thing I knew, and it was no small matter. Cisania had revealed to me that it had been none other than her murdered father who had organized the little trick with the lambs which had cost Zenobisana a sentence of 6 years' imprisonment. So the sergeant was right. I was bending over backwards so as not to admit that my client was nothing but a dangerous fugitive from justice. And yet he was wrong. Have you ever had an absolute certainty with nothing to back it up? A certainty that grows all the more certain the more appearances are against it.
The old woman scrutinized Bustiano. You've come all this way for nothing. Luisi took his family and they went off to America. He says they're right. They'll send money. Bustiano was sweating. But perhaps you can help me all the same. About a year ago, your son branded a number of head of cattle belonging to his employer. A farmhand came down from Nuoro to help him, a fair-haired young man with blue eyes. You can't fail to have noticed him. The woman looked at Bustiano. A handsome youngster, fresh in the face, she said. Wait here. When she came back out, she had something in her hand. Another photograph, taken at the farm by the same roving photographer. It showed Zenobi with the branding iron in his hand and Luigi Pereda holding a calf by its head, dated Galteli, December 28th, 1897, and a cipher on the back, AQB, and the number 28. Now, there was no doubt about it. Bustiano had been right. The numbers showed that the photographs, the branding and the young man's portrait, had been taken one after the other, on the 28th of December, the same day as the disappearance of the lambs. So, Zenobi was innocent. Sergeant Poli puffed warm breath on the fingers of his right hand. With the hint of a smile, Bustiano drew the 2 photographs from the pocket of his greatcoat. He laid them on the desk. Arturo Poli scanned them for a very long time indeed. Zenobisana and Luigi Pereda, busy branding cattle for Cosma Casula Pace, Bustiano said, indicating the other photograph. With a date, he added. The sergeant laughed out loud. I still don't follow you. I can help you there, said the lawyer. If Zenobisana was at Galteli on the 20th of December, he cannot have been at Mareri that same night to steal his employer's sheep. Secondly, seeing that he had had himself photographed, he had no reason to eliminate the photographer. Do you mean that the murder of Lecis is not connected to the Casula Pace affair? I mean nothing of the sort. I only said that it was not Zenobisana who killed him. The matter is much simpler than it appears to be. Cosma Casulapace does not want Zenobi for a son-in-law. He has an only daughter, Sicilia. He would jump in the lake rather than deny her wishes. He therefore organizes the business with the lambs. He sends Zenobi to Galtelli and arranges for Luigi Pereira to keep him there for at least 48 hours. He has no way of knowing about the photographer, and Pereira can only warn him when it is too late. In the meanwhile, the young man declares that he is innocent and unjustly accused. He takes to the hills to avoid arrest. Casulapace gets scared. He is afraid of retaliations, all the more so because his man down at Galtelli, Luigi Pereira, has informed him about the photographs. It therefore becomes indispensable to eliminate the photographer, and with him everything that might prove that Zenobisana was at Galtelli for the branding. He employs Pereira himself for this purpose. In exchange, he provides him with enough money to emigrate to America. But his luck is against him because the photographs have already been delivered. One to Galtelli, the other to Nuoro. And here they are. All right. But in the meantime, Cosma Casulapace is murdered, and Sana, although the victim of an injustice, is still the leading suspect. So we are back at square one, the sergeant concluded. When they bury Don Cosma, the whole town is there. Donna Dolores seems like the Madonna of the Seven Sorrows. It takes 3 people to support her as she follows the coffin. Then comes Sicilia, upright as a spindle. There is Bartolomeo Casulapace, 30-ish, thinner and taller than his dead brother. A handsome race, the Casulapace, but an unlucky one as well, having no male heirs. After Sicilia, Donna Dolores was unable to bear more children, and as for Bartolomeo marrying, there was no question of it. He was more of a priest than anything else, but he had money sense. He was the ready reckoner of the family firm. Bustiano took a seat. "You made me do this," said Sergeant Poli. "It was embarrassing." "So what does Bartolomeo have to say?" the lawyer asked. "Nothing. Nothing at all. As polite as could be. At my service, in fact. He can find nothing. No sum paid to Pereira, no payoff on leaving their service, no sign even that he has gone to America. But according to him, these matters were entirely in his late brother's hands, God rest him. Not to mention the fact that the farm at Galtelli belonged to his sister-in-law," said Sergeant Poli. "What? To Donna Dolores?" "Precisely, and therefore outside his financial control." "Therefore, the farm at Galtelli was not part of the estate itself?" "It seems not. In fact, it appears that Donna Dolores dealt with it personally." "How interesting," commented Bustiano. It was obvious that there was something fishy about the death of Cosma Casulapace. Glances were exchanged and eyebrows raised. For example, this business of the murder had fallen right on cue just as Bartolomeo Casulapace's 30th birthday was coming up. According to the will of his father, Battista Casulapace, if he reached 30 years of age without issue, he could claim only such an annual income as would enable him to live in a dignified manner. It made one think. It looked not quite right. Not to speak of Donna Dolores, who appeared to be the mistress and matriarch of all, but no use asking her the simplest question. It was always Bartolomeo who came up with the answer. Good Lord, how they understood each other, those two. They stuck to money like leeches. They say that in the matter of Battista's will, she was quite angry with her brother-in-law because he was against claiming rent for a farm at Convento, because he was hand in glove with the priests and had no wish to lay claim to a farm which had always been in their hands. But she was dead against this.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Things. I'm not one to listen to tittle-tattle. Bustiano stopped scrutinizing the lamb and fennel stew that lay on his plate. But how do you see it? Are Dolores and Bartolomeo on friendly terms or not? Raimunda shrugged. As far as I know, they're on the best of terms. Then what about the estate there at the Convento? There's talk about it, but no need to believe it, because they bought that land and assigned it to the priests rent-free, as Bartolomeo wished. What about Cosma? Oh, he, God rest his soul, did what he was told to do by his wife, once she'd talked it over with her brother-in-law. Therefore, it is possible that Cosma was not even opposed to a marriage between Sisinia and Zenobisana. Raimunda came and sat down in a chair immediately facing him. Bustia, just drop it, will you? That boy has cooked his own goose. At this point, what difference does it make whether he's guilty or not? It makes all the difference, believe you me. Bustiano's voice had risen by about 2 octaves. Don't yell at me, yelled Raimunda. I've told you what I think, but you go ahead and do as you wish, wasting time over these things. And eat up what you've got on your plate.
I didn't give up. There was evidence enough to investigate them, but it seemed that no one else cared. Where was Bartolomeo when his brother was murdered? Was Donna Dolores in league with her brother-in-law? I wouldn't be surprised to discover that they'd even organized the trick with the lambs. Where was Donna Dolores when her husband was killed? Who gave Luigi Peredda his fare to America and paid him off on leaving their employment? Cosma Casuro Pez could have been killed by at least 3 people. First, the brother, whose movements on the day of the murder were unknown, though on the other hand, no one had asked him about them. Then Donna Dolores. Yes, the woman herself. She could have had her motives. She had a loving husband, but not a very enterprising or decisive one. In both cases, it would explain why Cosma had allowed his murderer to take his gun without arousing his suspicion. He saw who killed him, but he did nothing, because he knew his murderer. But there was also Luigi Peredda. Who could lay hands on him? Who knew where he was, even? In America. Maybe his task had been this very one, the task for which he had been paid, you understand.
At a banquet for His Majesty's Royal Prosecutor, the entire Nuoro legal establishment was present. Bustiano was content to observe from the sidelines. On the opposite side of the room, the prosecutor was telling amusing anecdotes. My wife wanted to try her hand too, so she picked up the gun and fired it. The recoil knocked her backwards like a straw in the wind. Women, he added, and some even laughed. Bustiano leapt to his feet. "That's it! That's it! I should have thought of it sooner, damn it! I have to have a word with the sergeant." My father tells me that Zia Rosina kept on and on until she had persuaded her son to talk to Bustiano. Eventually, she blackmailed him by saying that if he didn't agree, she'd curse him from her grave. They found themselves face to face. Bustiano ran into him right outside his house. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The sky was pitch black, no moon. "Let's go somewhere safer," said Zenobi, leading the way. Bustiano didn't stir a limb. "My house is a safe place," he said, "since you've taken the trouble to make your way right to the door." "You're not alone," said Zenobi. "My mother sleeps on the other side of the house, and our maid doesn't live in. Let's go to my study. No one will think of looking for us there." "You run no risk here," repeated Bustiano as he lit the lamp on the table. Zenobi propped his gun in a corner piled high with legal files and remained on his feet before the desk. "Take a seat," said Bustiano, pointing to a chair opposite him. Then he started rummaging behind the door of a little cupboard. Zenobi gave a quick glance at his gun, within arm's reach. "Oh, here it is, Vernaccia," said Bustiano, holding up the bottle. Zenobi seemed to relax. "I don't trust anyone nowadays," he apologized with a smile. "If you want to get out of this situation," said Bustiano, "you simply have to trust someone." The young man shook his head. "What's done is done, Avocado. There's nothing left to hope for." "Nonsense. There's plenty to hope for. To start with, you've been sentenced for a crime you didn't commit. There's a photograph to prove it." Zenobi finally sat down. "Didn't he take it away with him?" "No. Luigi Pereira left it in the hands of his mother before he went off. Or maybe it was delivered directly to her when he had already left. What matters is that it is now in our own hands." "So they killed the photographer for nothing?" "Nothing at all. But there's a date on that photograph. December the 28th. I'd like to be sure that it's the correct date." "That's the date, all right. But you see, they can say that a date can always be added afterwards." "Yes, they could. I've already thought of that. But there's also a serial number." "I know. But they can also say that I wrote it myself because the fire in his studio destroyed everything." "I've thought of that too. But what they can't deny is that the photograph was taken at Galtilei." "So what?" Zenobi said. "I went down to Galtilei at least once a month. If only I were able to say what I know." "To me, you can say it. Chances are we'll sort the matter out." Zenobi slumped back in his chair. "There are people whom I don't want to implicate. In fact, I can't. Cizinia?" Zenobi gave an imperceptible nod. "She mustn't be brought into this business. I'd rather give myself up. I'd rather let them kill me." "Let's try and talk about the afternoon when Cosma Cosola Pace was murdered." Zenobi rubbed the back of his neck. "I was there," he said, in all simplicity. Bustiano lunged forward. "You were there?" "At Mareri, to see Cizinia," explained Zenobi. "We heard the shot and thought that Cosma had bagged a hare or a partridge, and then—" "And then?" "Cizinia suddenly got scared, and we ran up to the old olive tree and saw what there was to see." What did you see, Zenobi? I can't, was all he could say. You know as well as I do that I can't say a word. Donna Dolores? Demanded Bustiano, and Zenobi went on shaking his head slowly. Trust me, if anything is to be done for you and Cisania, then be candid with me. Sosmeris, her people. Thus Zenobi surrendered. Bartolomeo, insisted Bustiano. Bartolomeo and Donna Dolores, confirmed Zenobi. It's a family matter, Avocado. It's a thing to be sorted out within the family. Cosma was angry at his brother. There were constant arguments over a certain piece of land. The Convento farm? Just that. Cosma wanted to give it to Cisania as a dowry, and Bartolomeo wouldn't have it. And Donna Dolores? Oh, she never says a word. She acts. Those two made a pact, Avocado, and the result is that I am a dead man. But what possible interest could Donna Dolores have in getting her husband killed? Or in killing him herself? She'd have been up to it, Zenobi laughed. Take it from me. So that's how things went, in your opinion. I won't speak of what I don't know. All I know is that they were both there that afternoon. If anyone is going to destroy Cisinia's family, it won't be me. I'd rather go to jail. Cisinia didn't see anything. She was behind me, running as fast as she could. If that's the way things went, we'll soon find out. What do you mean to do? Asked Zenobi. I want to lure the beast out of its lair, and to do so, I have to delve into the lair. You understand? His idea was that if he could break the links of common interest between Bartolomeo and Donna Dolores, they would tear each other to shreds. Cosma's death solved a lot of problems. The inheritance, for example, that would no longer be at the mercy of that famous clause in the will concerning Bartolomeo's 30th birthday. Donna Dolores was smart enough to realize that, however things went, Don Bartolomeo would find a loophole to get out of renouncing his share. She was greed personified. Why share out what she could have whole and entire? So the question boiled down to this. Once the term of her widow's mourning was over, could Donna Dolores pass from one brother to the other? In the meantime, though, she had made a few mistakes. The first was to think that Bartolomeo was more easily manipulated than his brother, the late lamented Cosma. The second was to underestimate the bond between Zenobi and Cisania, and this was a very grave error, because the attempt to part them had only brought them closer together. To put it briefly, Bustiano's plan was to lead Donna Dolores and Don Bartolomeo to suspect each other, and thence lure them out into the open.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
would tackle Donna Dolores, request an interview with her, and inform her of the anonymous letter. He would air certain suspicions without making any direct accusations. If the influence of Donna Dolores over her brother-in-law was such as I thought it to be, the Church risked the loss of a considerable source of income. My part was to deal with the priests and Don Bartolomeo Casula Pes.
Bustiano was anti-clerical to the marrow. The abbot, Don Podda, was staggered to see him at the church. "Hold off killing the fatted calf. I am here for bureaucratic reasons," said Bustiano. "I'm doing a favour to a friend who has to get together the documents for the purchase of a piece of land. You'll understand my reticence. The dealings are particularly confidential." Who'd have thought it? That land up for sale? The abbot gave Bustiano a look. "A piece of land?" "I've made a promise," said Bustiano. "The negotiations are entirely confidential. Besides, I am telling you nothing you don't already know. And if you don't know, then... No, let's drop the matter. I only mentioned it to you because I'm sure you have already been informed." The abbot started to get nervous. Of course, he stammered. "I think I have grasped what you're speaking of." But he hadn't grasped a thing. "In this way, a nasty business will come to a happy ending," continued Bustiano. "A marriage that will put all to rights. Those lands will return to the family, and if they get a good round sum for it, this I say between you and me, I have heard that a very generous emolument comes also to the church. And now I beg you not to make me add another word."
At the top of the hill of Sant Onofrio, the early spring sun glittered on the rose-grey rock. I sat on my usual boulder, clasped my hands over the top of my stick. Then I heard someone behind me. A young man standing there, bristling with black hair on his jaw and forearms. "Tell me, are you the avvocato?" "Indeed I am," I said. "A certain person wishes to say a few words to you, if it is not inconvenient for you to follow me." It was what I had been waiting a whole week for. I gave the lad a nod. Without a second's hesitation, he set off down the hill.
In the meanwhile, Donna Dolores had done her utmost to avoid seeing Sergeant Poli. She only gave way when she realized that the sergeant had no intention of leaving. So she issued forth from her room, lovely as a statue, dark as a starless night.
The boy had led me to the cathedral, where after a short while Don Podda ushered me down a narrow corridor. The room into which the priest led me was furnished in grand style with massive furniture. A few logs were burning in the fireplace. Don Bartolomeo Casula Pes was standing silhouetted before this fireplace. "The canon has been at pains to inform me that you have information that concerns me. Concerns my family, that is." "May I sit down?" I asked. Bartolomeo Casula Pes gave permission with the merest lowering of his eyelids. "They tell me," he said, "that you have been retained as a lawyer with regard to the sale of a certain estate owned by our family. This surprises me in view of the fact that the land is not for sale." "It may be that someone in your family has considered other possibilities. We are speaking of an estate that increases in value year by year." Don Bartolomeo thought for a moment. "You can tell your so-called client that the assignment of that estate will not be changed." "Very well. I shall refer this to my client. If you now tell me that you have changed your minds, I cannot but take it into consideration." "Do so," cried Don Podder, nodding furiously. "I presume," he went on, "that it is also useless to ask you who was the direct source?" "You presume rightly," I said. "Avvocato, we have a tragic death in the family. Why do you want to complicate matters that are so straightforward? That lad condemned himself. If he hadn't done anything, he shouldn't have run away." Don Podder nodded vigorously. "It's not as simple as that," I replied after a few moments. "There are proofs that Zanobi Sanna was not in Nuoro on the night of December the 28th, when he was accused of the theft." "Proofs?" inquired Bartolomeo. "A photograph taken by a roving photographer down at Galtali." "The photographer who was done to death?" "I see you're in possession of the facts. Then you realize that if that particular indictment falls flat, all the rest of it is called into question." "Nothing is called in question. That scoundrel has to end his days in jail. Otherwise—" "Otherwise?" "We are people of some standing in these parts, Avvocato." "Is that a threat?" "No threat at all," purred Don Podder in conciliatory tones. "It is better to leave things as they stand. That's all he wished to say." "I know what I wish to say," snarled Don Bartolomeo, turning on him in rage. "Dig in the dirt, and you get muck on your own hands."
Donna Dolores confined herself to a swift glance at the anonymous letter, then replaced it on the table as if it were burning her fingers. "People are too nasty-minded and envious," was all she said. "All the same," insisted Sergeant Poli, "this anonymous letter had to be registered in the files, and it could well be that Sanna's lawyer might make use of it to cast doubts on the whole case." Donna Dolores began to breathe rather heavily. "What sort of doubts?" "Different possibilities. You know how things go in a court of law." Donna Dolores replied that there were no doubts at all. That afternoon she had never stirred out of the house. "Very well," smiled Sergeant Poli. "There is no problem, then. When asked, you will reply that you were not at Mareri that afternoon." "Exactly," confirmed Donna Dolores.
In the seminary, the silence had become intolerable. "I have to speak to you in private, Don Bartolomeo," I said. Bartolomeo Casulapes made an abrupt gesture to the priest. Don Podder gave me a look full of rancour and left the room. "The life of a man which has been entrusted to my care depends upon what I am about to tell you." "I'm listening," he said. "You were seen at Mareri a few minutes after the death of your brother. This information has been held secret by the competent authorities. I now put myself in the wrong by revealing it to you." Don Bartolomeo's eyelids closed slowly. Then he asked, "By whom?" "It doesn't matter. It's purely a question of when. That is why I wondered whether, if you had some explanation for your presence at Mareri, you might not prefer to give it to me, even if unofficially, rather than going to the police to make a signed statement." "And by what authority are you acting, if I may ask?" "Simply by the fact that I am the only person who can help you, and the fact that I do not take you for a murderer." Bartolomeo Casulapes swayed slightly on his feet. "Then I couldn't go on," he said. "I couldn't hold out. Do you know what it is to desire a woman more than your own life? Groping for somewhere to sit down and flopping back in the armchair. I've sometimes hoped that Cosmo would die, and when he did die, I felt no more than a wonderful sense of relief. God forgive me. And he covered his face with his hands.
Of course, if you have someone who can corroborate this fact, ventured Sergeant Poley. Corroborate what? Stormed Donna Dolores. Corroborate the fact of your being at home that afternoon, explained Sergeant Poley. If I were to ask your maid, for example. She wouldn't be able to tell you, snapped Donna Dolores. That Tuesday she had a nephew to look after.
Bartolomeo bowed his head. Yes, I went to Mareri, but I got there too late. Cosma was dead. Dolores was there, not far from the body. We heard footsteps. It was Cisania running up, having heard the shots. Dolores was behaving like a madwoman. It was all I could do to drag her to a place of hiding. She was talking gibberish, saying that she had done it for both of us, you understand? She said that Cosma had threatened her, that he had found out the truth about Zenobi and the lambs, that he was beside himself with rage, that he loved Zenobi like a son. She even said that he had threatened to send her back to where he had picked her up, practically out of the gutter. She said that if we didn't hurry up, the Convento land would end up as part of Cisnia's dowry. I don't know exactly how it happened. I only know that she took the gun and shot him.
Don Bartolomeo got 12 years imprisonment, and Donna Dolores was sentenced to 30. Cisania renounced her rights to the estate and was married in the clothes she was standing up in. Zenobi and Cisania begged Bustiano to be their witness, but he wouldn't hear of it. That they were as happy as possible was all he wished. On the very afternoon of the wedding breakfast, he was seen striding off for his daily beloved walk.
And here am I, seated on the hilltop. I take a deep breath and feel that all that blue light, that green, and the rolling stubble fields make their secret way into my body. For this land is to me both my joy and my torment, and I curse it. I curse it, even while I worship it.